I love podcast guesting because, first of all, you're introduced to audiences. So you're being introduced to hosts who have already started up their communities. They've done the legwork of putting in those years of service to build up a community. And you're stepping right in. Not only are you stepping in and being able to have access to their audience, but you're also getting their credibility as well. So if you're a health coach that goes on a nutritionist show, for example, and this nutritionist is like built up a really large audience, they're well respected, that trust that the audience has in the nutritionist is then going to be passed on to you, and they're going to see you as a health coach that they can trust. So I think that's a really important factor.
Welcome to another episode of the Health Coach Academy podcast. I'm your host, Omar Cumberbatch of OmarCumberbatch.com. As always, appreciate you joining in, listening to new and good stuff in the health coaching space. So today I have the honor of having Sam Brake Guia on the show. And I was on Sam's podcast. It's called Mics to Millions, and had a great time over there. And he is just amazing in what he's doing in the podcast space. So it's always very cool to welcome a fellow podcaster on the show and really just get into the business of podcasting, specifically being a guest on podcasts. And as you can imagine, it's been just a wonderful ride. Over 200 episodes that I've had and just meeting so many different people. But one of the things that keeps coming up is the huge advantage of being on other people's podcasts. And that's really something that's special because you basically are being introduced to a different audience that you have never been in front of before. And Sam is going to break that down and see how he utilizes some of those strategies. So really excited about that. If you listen to the last episode, I gave you a little bit of a tidbit about what's on the horizon with the book and just a wonderful guest that I'm going to be displaying in that book about how we can make the health coaching space more lucrative. So there's more to come on that. So I did not forget, I'm going to have some podcasts with myself and some other guests that are going to be dealing with that around the many topics that we're going to be discussing in that book. As always, please leave a rating and review on iTunes. It gives me an opportunity to always get wonderful guests like Sam on the show. So appreciate you as always. Let's jump into it. Hey, Sam, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm very good. Thank you very much for having me, Omar.
Yeah, listen, this is a pleasure. I want to just right off the bat, just so the audience knows, and I think we're going to dive into this pretty heavy in this particular conversation. I want to thank you for so much of the success of this particular podcast. Actually, both podcasts, you hooked me up with a bazillion guests, and there's such high quality guests, and your company has looked out for me so much over the years. I want to just acknowledge you and the company as well, because I probably would not be as successful. I guarantee I wouldn't be as successful without you and the support that you provided this podcast and my other podcast, this podcast Burst Fast. So I want to thank you right off the bat.
Hey, man, thank you so much as well, because it's always so wonderful. And it's such a delight when we work with podcast hosts that are always so receptive and open to the suggestions that we have. And it really is a win-win relationship. So I'm just as happy to be working with you, and it's really wonderful to have that feedback.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I kind of jumped the gun probably a little bit. Let us hear what your company actually does, a little bit about I think that would be even a cool thing to just jump into some questions about that and how we go about our process.
Yeah, certainly. So I'm a co-founder of PodWritten. We are a podcast guest booking agency that specifically helps health and wellness professionals and businesses gain greater visibility, primarily through podcast guesting. But we also help with content writing as well, and we partner them up. I'm going to get into that a little bit there, and how the content writing and podcast guesting support each other. But yeah, in a nutshell, that is what we do. So obviously health coaches are a primary audience that we love to work with.
Yeah, no, it's really a great service. And again, I could count probably, this feels like hundreds of guests that you've thrown my way, and they've all been fantastic. So I guess one of the main things that I wanted to kind of get at was there is a concept of being on podcasts that I guess it escapes a lot of people because it is an absolutely incredible marketing strategy for you to get yourself out there and be recognized as a brand and get in front of other audience. Says, how did you stumble upon this, and why did you think it's such an effective means of getting the message about a person's business out?
Yeah, for health coaches, there's lots of opportunities to market yourself realistically. Social media is a common one that I see. And I feel that when you compare podcasting to other forms of marketing, there are some really kind of strong factors that make it the go-to option for marketing your health coaching business. For example, the audiences that listen to podcasts are super dedicated. So if you think about this, Buzzsprout shared data last year that podcast listeners are some of the most dedicated audiences that you can find online. And 80% of listeners will listen to all or almost all of every podcast episode they start. And if you compare that to Instagram Reels, on average, a user will pay attention to 3 seconds of an Instagram Reel. So immediately, if you're going after podcast guesting as a marketing approach, you're going to hold and retain the attention of the audiences that you're getting in front of for much longer, and you're going to be able to go into much greater depth about the topics. And obviously, when it comes to health, it's hard to summarize something in 3 seconds. There's a lot of detail that you need to go into, and podcasting really lends itself to that. And also, I would say that one of the great things about podcasting, even if you are someone that is heavy on social media, podcasting can easily be repurposed for more content. So you can take a podcast episode, and much like we do with our services, you can then turn it into a blog. Or alternatively, you can turn it into social media content. So it's a lot easier to chop up a podcast episode and turn it into content for your website or social media rather than doing it like the reverse. So I would definitely say that that's one of the strongest factors when it comes to podcast guesting. And also even in this, as an example, we built up a really strong relationship through you guesting on my podcast, and also I've now guesting on your podcast, and I've come to know you really well, Omar, obviously through the emails that we've sent with me hooking you up with guests, but also you get a chance to speak with people one-on-one, which in today's society, to have a 60-minute conversation with someone completely uninterrupted without phones or other things distracting you is a real rarity. So it's a form of networking that is so unique, and you can do it from the comfort of your own home. So if you are a health coach, you can definitely get on the platforms of other people and build up connections that are going to help propel your business and get you more coverage.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point, because I think without a doubt, the two things that you touched on that I think are the most phenomenal aspects of podcasting are the networking components to this. You meet amazing people without a doubt. Mm-hmm. And also just the ease of content creation. Content creation is probably the hardest thing that you're going to do. Period. And this is just the easiest form of creating content because, and especially being a host, my guests are my content.
Yeah.
And it never is stale. I remember starting out trying to blog, and I was like, well, what am I going to write about every week? Right. It's just where you give me the content by me exposing your unique experiences. So I'm definitely glad that you touched on both of those. Definitely. So I'm curious, because now you've kind of been on both sides of the fence, and I have my opinion on this, and I'd love to discuss this with you. Mm-hmm. What do you think is being the more advantageous, being a podcast host or a podcast guest?
I think it really depends, because there are pros and cons of both. So first of all, if you're a podcast host, then you kind of need to build up that community. So I think if you're someone that has a large following, so if you already have a huge social media following, I've definitely seen this where I've come across a podcast and they've got a handful of episodes yet they've got a ton of ratings and they're really high up on listen notes there. The podcast is doing really well, and then I do some research and I'm like, oh wait, they've got 1 million TikTok followers. So I think when you have your own community to start off with, your podcast is going to hit the ground running. Alternatively, if you are going to start a podcast, then you need to be prepared that it's going to take a couple of years before you really get the ball rolling. It's because it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort. But once you have that kind of community, podcasts are fantastic. It is a great platform to have control over. And obviously you have complete control over everything. You decide the content, you decide how the interview is going to go, who you're going to interview. So you have a great deal of power in that sense. But the thing that I like about podcast guesting, which for me makes it like personally a winner, even though I love hosting my own podcast, I've set up many podcasts, produced many podcasts for other companies as well. I love podcast guesting because, first of all, you're introduced to audiences. So you're being introduced to hosts who have already started up their communities. They've done the legwork of putting in those years of service to build up a community. And you're stepping right in. Not only are you stepping in and being able to have access to their audience, but you're also getting their credibility as well. So if you're a health coach that goes on a nutritionist show, for example, and this nutritionist has like built up a really large audience, they're well respected, that trust that the audience has in the nutritionist is then going to be passed on to you. And they're going to see you as a health coach that they can trust. So I think that's a really important factor. Another thing as well is I will say that they're not just doing the legwork for you up until that point, but it's also afterwards. If you're a host, like with this podcast episode, for example, I'm turning up, we're recording this episode, and as soon as we're done, like it's on you, Omar, to get that episode across the finish line and get it published and sorted. Whereas like when you're a guest, you don't have to worry about that so much. And another thing that I really love is that like as if you guest on a show where the podcast host is clearly committed and is like consistent, these episodes can have a really long shelf life. And as their show grows, as this podcast that you've guested on has grown, it will become more visible over time. And I've definitely had this conversation with certain hosts where they'll say they'll publish an episode and even like 3 years later, it's still collecting listens and plays. So that's really valuable. And then finally, I really like the fact that you are not like being committed or you don't necessarily have to be fully committed like a podcast. If you're going to do a podcast, then like I said, you got to build up like a year, 2 years. You really got to put the effort in. You got to put like an episode out every week. There is a solid commitment there to your fans, to your audience, to the mission that you're trying to do or you're trying to strive to achieve. And with podcast guesting, you can do as much or as little of it as you like. So you could just do a huge push, and in 6 months, you could just try and get on as many high quality podcasts as you like. And then once that's done, you can step away and it doesn't matter. And you can take some time off. So you can jump in as much or as little as you like to do podcast guesting. So that's one aspect that I really like of it. And that's just my own experience. I'm curious to hear what you think, because I know you've done both sides as well.
No, I agree with you 100% on that aspect. I was actually really, and I think you've helped me along with this too, really understanding the value of being the guest on a show. And, me being on your show, you really get the feedback from a different audience and speak to people that you never spoke to before. I think what's interesting is that when you are a host, right? And if you don't position yourself properly, and it's something I'm just kind of uncovering, it's like the expert is your guest. Mm-hmm. And that kind of gives, unless you do it right, it takes away from your knowledge of the subject. So in essence, like, we're talking about podcasts. Obviously, I have 2 podcasts. You are a master of podcast guesting. If I don't express my knowledge in this episode of it, it would be a completely one-sided conversation where you are that dude. And I always liken it to like, if we're a coach, right? And we're just like a Joe Rogan. Is anybody ever going on Joe Rogan's show to hire Joe Rogan? It's like, no, it's like, they want to hear the conversation that he has with this particular expert, and who's going to get that part of the business. His business model, of course, is all, and as you know, like, just, affiliate marketing, sponsorships, et cetera. And just because, have 11 million people listen to a show a week, it's, that's how you're going to get paid. But it's interesting because you have a philosophy we're going to get into too about positioning yourself for your business when you do podcast guesting. I think that's something that I uncovered and just really had that aha moment about relatively recently.
Yeah, I completely agree. You nailed it. Like it is hard when you are interviewing people because you're really giving them the spotlight and the opportunity to let them shine. And of course, there are times when you can jump in and say, "Oh yeah, I've experienced that or I've had that." But really, the setup for the show is for you to extract knowledge from them, not for you to present yourself as the expert necessarily or steal the limelight. So yeah, I think that's a really important fact that you brought up there.
Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting evolution of the learning of all things business in general. So yeah, no, I definitely want to dive into this because you also had like tremendous success in actually helping your clients,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, just in general. So I know that you did mention at one point that you had a time where you booked a health coach client on more than like 22 shows in about a half a year,
Mm-hmm.
and that just gave them a tremendous amount of clients and leads. Can
Mm-hmm.
you talk about that situation and just how it can play out for someone who's interested in this type of forum?
Yeah, definitely. So, to give your audience some background on the client, her name is Ali Shapiro. She is the creator of Truce with Food. The Truce.
Oh, yeah, I know Ali.
I know, yeah.
She's been
She
on
was,
this podcast.
we hooked up. Yeah, one of the shows was actually one of those 22 shows, I think, was this show, in fact. And yeah, if people want to check that episode out, Omar did do an interview with her. It's titled Entrepreneurship by Experience: How Your Life Story Shapes Your Business Strategy. So yeah, definitely listeners go back and check out Omar's interview with her. And she is she has an incredible program where she focuses mostly on emotional eating. She's also a podcast host of the top 1% ranked Insatiable. And she came to us because she wanted to bring more clients to her Truce programs, like I mentioned, Truce with Food and her Truce coaching certification. And she actually discovered the power of podcast guesting on her own as a result of an interview she secured by herself. And from that interview, people began reaching out to her as a result. And she decided, you know what, there's some real value in this. I'm going to take on a professional podcast booking agency to take this further. And the funny thing is she actually has experience in PR. She has experience pitching. So she could have sent these pitches herself. But the reason she chose to find an agency is because, well, there's 5 million podcasts out there. And just taking the time to sift through what is valuable, what's worth it, conducting the outreach and all of that, she wanted to just find a professional. She came to us, and within 6 months, yeah, we secured her 22 podcast interviews and got various clients and leads from these features. And I believe the reason it was so successful is because we identified her audience and we specifically targeted shows which spoke to the audience she wanted to go after. And instead of focusing on like quantity of interviews where we just go after as many interviews as we can, we really focused on the quality of interviews with podcasts that were a right fit for her and her message, much like your podcast, this show. It was fantastic for her. This is one thing that I really love about podcast guesting and why it works so well for her is you can get super specific with the niches that you target. And we focus on emotional eating podcasts instead of going after generic health and wellness podcasts. And we also found some, through the process of pitching, we refined our approach because we also found some success with midlife coaching, midlife podcasts and sobriety podcasts. So we refined our approach and also went after those. And this way we made sure that her message was delivered to the right audience and that was super receptive of what she had to say.
Yeah, no, that is definitely an interesting dynamic. And now let me ask you, have you expanded on that at all? Have you just niched down into those specific categories?
What with regards to pitching Ali?
Oh, just like you had mentioned some topics that, yeah, as far as like midlife and emotional eating, like,
yeah. So like we as like a health and wellness podcast booking agency, we focus on like the broad spectrum of health and wellness. But one
okay,
of the benefits of like working with us is because we just focus on health and wellness. We have developed a large network of like contacts where we've booked people in the past and they trust us much like yourself. They're like, oh, I know Sam, he like sends good guests. I'm going to open up his pitches or the stuff that he sends us. So we do have we have like good connections with those podcasts now, and it's kind of like a positive upward spiral where like you get you get guests booked and then they're open to it. And then on top of that, you got the social credibility of like having guests booked in this range, in this kind of niche or this podcast area, which gets you on more podcasts and gets you on more podcasts. So it's been like quite positive in that sense.
Yeah, no, I definitely believe that. And so, like I said, upward spiral, it really does help. And it's very dynamic. I definitely give that. And again, it just keeps reinforcing the network and the networking aspect of this whole podcasting, which is really one of my favorite parts of it. So what are some of the myths about being a podcast guest?
Okay, yeah. So people have a lot of preconceptions, I think, about podcast guesting, and maybe there are certain mental hurdles which are holding them back. I would say one of the biggest ones is like without strong connections with hosts that you can't get booked on podcasts. So obviously I mentioned just before this that it is good to have the connections because they open the door for the next time you try and get a client. We try and get a client booked. But if you are a health coach and you're thinking, you know what, I don't have connections with hosts, what am I going to do? Well, I can honestly assure you that if you have something valuable to say, if you have something which is going to provide value to the host that you're reaching out to, that can get you just as far with a cold pitch as it can with a warm connection. Because at the end of the day, hosts are very protective of their audiences. Hosts want to turn up every week with value for their audience because that's how they attract their audience in the first place and how they keep them. So as long as you are pitching something valuable that the host is going to be interested in, then really it doesn't matter if you have that connection or not. And I have to say, like every single host that I have pitched personally, at some point we were strangers. At some point I had never been in their inbox and I managed to connect with them because of a cold pitch. And that's how it's worked with everyone we've connected with. So don't let that discourage you if you don't have those connections in place already. If you do, excellent, leverage them. But I would say, yeah, do not let that discourage you. And also it's the same for large social media numbers. So one of the things that I get asked a lot is like, is it important if I don't have a huge online social media following? And I'm not going to deny there is value in having a large social media following because it's kind of like a social currency, or it's like a currency that can like demonstrate social credibility and proof and value. But just like I mentioned with the connections, if you are delivering a topic that's valuable, then that's what the host is going to be interested in. You can deliver something which shows that you have taken the time to analyze the show, listen to episodes, and really customize a pitch that delivers value. Then your social media numbers, they're not really going to hold you back because you're delivering the most important thing that the host wants to see and hear. And then finally, I would say like some people feel that they're held back because they don't have a technical background, or maybe they believe they need expensive equipment in order to do podcast guesting. But the truth is, it's really quite simple. I'm not a technical guy myself, and I still managed to figure this out. I don't know if you're technical as well.
Not at all.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's the case for a lot of podcast hosts and podcast guests. So don't worry, you don't need a technical background. And also, equipment doesn't have to be expensive. You can get a mic off Amazon for like $100, and that'll be good enough to give you like decent quality to turn up with to your podcast interviews. So yeah, if you don't have the connections, you don't have the social media numbers, and you don't have a technical background, don't let any of that stop you. If you're a health coach that wants to get your message out there, you can honestly get out there and get booked on shows. And I'm going to show you how. I actually do have a free template or a guide that I'm going to share with you, Omar, and you can add it to the show notes and listeners can get it as well. So don't worry, don't let that stop you. You're going to do great.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. And I wholeheartedly agree with everything that you just said. And it is interesting, like I've been on bigger shows, bigger guests have been on my shows. And it is really about the value, because the content is really what drives on both directions. You know, people want to hear these expert opinions, and I guess a lot of people don't recognize how powerful their own stories are, just because they live it, and they just really and they're always comparing themselves to a sea of other individuals. But it's a big deal. And like I said, if you have a good message, people are interested in that message, but more so than anything else.
Yeah. And I think that like health coaching, I'm not going to lie, like it's a saturated industry. There's a lot of people out there doing that online.
Hmm.
And it can be hard to compete, but you do have a unique message. No one's lived the life you have. No one's got the stories that you have. No one has like the same experiences that you have exactly. So I think once you're able to channel that into a message which delivers value, then absolutely there's nothing stopping you.
So when you do get a particular person who wants to jump on and take advantage of PodWritten and wants to start guesting, how far along do you suggest they are in their business strategy, business model, and all that good stuff? Like, do you want a newbie who's just say, I just want to be on podcast to just jump in, or is there some more foundational pieces that you look for before you start getting them to where they need to go?
Yeah, so I mean, people come to us from all different levels and all different stages, and it really depends on what the overarching focus of their business is. Because how you approach everyone is going to change depending on what they're after. So, for example, if you are a health coach and you've got a book coming out, if your book launches in a month, then we're not going to be able to help you with that, honestly, because there's a long lead time with podcast guesting. Like, if you
Mm-hmm.
want to promote a book launch, then you should be looking at coming to at pitching yourself or hiring the help of a podcast booking agency like us at least like 9 months in advance, because there is a long lead time on how long it takes to send out the pitches and get the bookings coming in, recording them and getting them published. So it all depends on what the overarching goal is, but I wouldn't say that there is no one that I would be like I said before, like you don't need to worry about if you don't have the connections, experience, the social media presence. There are so many podcasts out there um, for so many niches, and there's so many different ways to level up your experience. Like I worked with one client a year ago. I started working with her just over a year ago, and she had never been on a podcast before, and we did a mock interview, and she did good. And I gave her some tips and insights, and we've now been working together for 18 months. And the other day, she landed a big podcast interview, and they've got like 2.8 million social media followers, and she's had loads of like messages, and it's been huge. And I was saying to her like, this is incredible. Like just over like a year and a half ago when we started working together, this never would have been possible. And now a year and a half later, here we are, and we've got landed this like huge podcast interview. So I definitely feel that no matter where you are at on your journey, like there is an opportunity for you to grow. There's an opportunity for you to get your message out there. And with every podcast interview that you do, it's an opportunity to refine your message. So I will say this: one of the things that Ali, the health coach that I mentioned earlier, really got from podcast guesting was that a lot of her podcast interviews turned into almost like coaching sessions, like unintentionally. And
Mm-hmm.
B, she was also able to refine her message. So the way she spoke with podcast hosts also helped to refine her message of how she presented her overall course, or how she presented her business. So it really forces you to kind of assess where you're going with your business, what you want to achieve, and how you present it. So I feel like podcast guesting, regardless of what stage you're at, it is incredibly advantageous.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And like I said, you work with that person for 18 months, and that whole 18 months, I'm sure as she was getting, you know, guest opportunities after guest opportunities, they were just sharpening that sword, and getting better
Mm-hmm.
and better at that communication. And that's one thing I give podcasting a lot of credit for as well, is you just don't realize how much better you become as a communicator and
Mm-hmm.
a speaker and just someone who's more intuitive to trends in the industry, because you start getting feedback from a lot of different people and
Mm-hmm.
questions. It is. I like how you said that spiral. It's like an upwards spiral,
Yeah.
and it's like a tornado. It's just taking up all these different things, and it's like, well, you are a completely different person 18 months after the fact. So I'm glad you highlighted that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I would highly recommend anyone like who's thinking about it to try and get started. And one thing that I would say, if you're like absolutely nervous about it, I mean, there's no reason to be, but one thing that I've heard from a podcast host I interviewed on Mike's to Millions, my podcast, where I interview podcast hosts like Omar about how they've managed to grow their shows. One guest actually said that she started off by doing Instagram lives, and that's perfectly fine. I mean, like if you want to practice your speaking and practice your messaging, and you don't feel like you're ready to jump on a podcast yet, just do a couple Instagram lives, and once you develop that kind of like confidence, then maybe look to get on some health and wellness podcasts.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting that people have that fear. And I've always equated that to a guest that I had back in the day, and it's just kind of resonated with me ever since. It's like when you start, there's nothing to be fearful for because nobody's listening anyway. So it's like you're good, man. You just talk
it's like
yourself.
Practice. Yeah.
Right. And it's funny that I wish I saved some of these things. I have so many great examples of that where like you see like the big titans of the industry trying to do things when they're just starting out and they're literally unrecognizable from what they are today. They're like, using like, bootleg cameras or, just even microphones, they sound like crap. It's just like, it's fascinating, but it is also a good way to humble yourself to know that eventually you'll get there.
Yeah. It's just a process. Yeah.
So speaking of processes, you say that you do have a 30-day plan to start like this particular journey. And I guess, we could talk about this all day, and I appreciate you taking the time out to share these ideas with the audience and to kind of give them a little bit of secret of my success. Can you get into that a little bit before we cut out?
Yeah, sure. So let's say, so don't worry, if you are listening to this and you've got a pen and paper ready and you're ready to take notes, that relax, because like I said, I'm going to share this with Omar and it's going to be in the show notes. And also I'm going to share the link at the end of the episode. So you are going to be able to get a full guide on how to do this. But I'm going to explain it now while we are together. I would say week 1 is the first week in which you want to map out your podcast guesting journey. So like I mentioned before, it's really important to understand what your goals are. So in this first week, you want to identify why you want to be a podcast guest. Like, do you want to establish yourself as an industry expert? Do you want to boost brand visibility? Or do you have a retreat or a book that you want to promote? Because obviously the time of the retreat or the book is going to impact like how quickly things will move along and also the types of podcasts you're going to target. So understanding your own underlying motivation is crucial in that point. And this is particularly important because it will impact the podcast that you select and how you craft your message. So ask yourself, like, what specific goals do I aim to accomplish through podcast guesting over the next 6 months? Who is my target audience that will best support me in achieving these goals? What unique topics and perspectives can I bring to podcast interviews? And what primary action do I want listeners to take after hearing my interview? What's my call to action going to be? So really take the first week to focus on that. And then in the second week, you'll want to look for podcasts. So discover podcasts that will help you connect with the audiences that you're going after. And you don't just want to focus on getting on as many podcasts as you can, because not all podcasts are the same. Like, you really want to focus on podcasts that are your niche. So if you're a health coach, for example, that just works with I don't know, in the realm of works with vegan clients, random example, then maybe you're just going to want to go after podcasts that focus on vegan diets or vegan health coaching podcasts. So the best thing to do, I would say, is find 10 podcasts, 10 target podcasts that focus on your niche, listen to them, take notes on why you'd make a great guest, what you like about the show. Do your research on these 10 podcasts. And then on week 3, you want to get the ball rolling with your pitches. So in the guide that I'm going to share, we've got a pitch template that you can use. And with that, you want to personalize it. Personalization is super important because podcast hosts get a ton of pitches from people wanting to be on their show. And a lot of the time, it's like a copy and paste template. And you don't want to just send out a copy and paste template, because that's not really going to rise above the rest. You really want to show that you have done your research on the show and you're offering something that is valuable specifically to this podcast. So use the information that you found in week 2 from your research, tailor the pitch, and send out those pitches. So start your outreach, and I would definitely say that should be something that you do early Monday or Tuesday morning, because they're generally the best times to send out your pitches. Now, in the final week, week 4, you are going to want to send out your follow-ups. We also have a follow-up template that you can use in the guide. And essentially you just want to check it back in and see if they've had a chance to read it. And then continue the process. So find another 10 podcasts, research them, pitch them, and just keep rinsing and repeating that process. So that's 4 weeks essentially. I know it should be 30 days. Take the last 2 days off. You earned it.
Definitely. I'm glad that you mentioned the follow-up component, because we do get tons of solicitations to be on the show, and stuff gets buried very fast. And that was one of the things, again, that I did learn from you as well. It's just that, just a friendly reminder, and it was never like, oh, no, I'm just ignoring them. Or like, but I think, especially a health coach starting out who might be in this game, they're like, okay, that person doesn't want me on the show. Then the story, now they're getting bombarded with different types of solicitations, some that have nothing to do with anything, right? It kind of just, it gets buried. So yeah, the key is definitely in the follow-up, and I think that's a good opportunity to let the audience know, like listen, even in everything, especially when you're just sending out emails, just the gold is in that follow-up, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'd follow up. We do like a week after, send out the pitch on a Tuesday. And then if we don't hear back from them a week later, we'll follow up. Usually we just do one follow up. There's mixed opinions. I hear some people think that 2 follow-ups is better. I personally don't have a strong opinion on this. I prefer to do 1 follow-up because I don't want to come across as pushy. But again, if anyone has data to suggest that 2 follow-ups in podcast pitching is better, then by all means, reach out to me on LinkedIn, Sam Brake Guia, send me a message. I'd love to see that data. But from what we operate with, a single follow-up is usually good. And like I said, we'll have the template so you can just like copy our approach.
No, definitely. Hey, Sam, listen, you delivered today. I know that, again, like you just heard an example of like what the power of podcast guesting is. So I definitely want to give you an opportunity to just let everybody know how to keep up with all the great stuff that you're doing, including your website, social media handles, and just how could someone who's interested in doing something like this and hiring a professional in this arena, what do they have to do to hook up with you and your company?
Fantastic. Thanks, man. Yeah. So first of all, podwritten.com/podcast guesting. That is where you'll go if you want the full guide that I've been talking about this whole time. And that will guide you through the 4-step process or 4-week process along with templates. So podwritten.com/podcast guesting. And there's no space in between podcast guesting. I'll also send over my link, so it'll be in the show notes. And if you are interested in talking to me about podcast guesting services, you can find our services page, podwritten.com/services. And also, if you want to chat to me about podcast guesting, I'm completely available. Hit me up on LinkedIn, Sam Brake Guia. I think I'm the only person in the world with my name, so it should be pretty easy to find. But by all means, reach out. I'd love to hear from you.
I appreciate it. Yeah. And like continuously keep on doing what you're doing. Keep me in mind for any guests, as always. Because like I said, I don't know where I would be without you guys over there in PodWritten. So yeah, you guys do a wonderful job, great service. And as well as you can advertise, you're a great person, especially with your podcast. I love the podcast. I love the direction it is. And it tells a lot, especially for people who are interested in getting on the other side of podcasts as well. So thank you for all you do.
Oh, my pleasure, man. Thank you for having me today.
My pleasure. Have a great rest of the day. Hope you enjoyed listening to today's episode of the Health Coach Academy podcast. If you did, jump over to iTunes and leave a rating and or review. It goes a long way in helping get this message out to our fellow health coaches and people in our industry. Also, if you can, jump over to my website, omarcumberbatch.com, where I give out a lot of freebies, including my 5-day sugar challenge for people who are having issues with sugar. And also for health coaches, I have the book, Hidden,
It's the 6 not so obvious ways to get your clients unstuck. Have a great day.